all about ancient Greece. And thank you so much for joining us. We're nearly at the end of our studies all about ancient Greece. We only have next week and this week left. And so today we are going to be looking at something we haven't touched on actually yet, but really important when you're looking at the ancient Greeks. And we're going to look at ancient Greek beliefs, particularly about gods and goddesses, because I know lots of you have requested it. So that's what we are going to be looking at today. I think I should have a prize to who gets their comments in first. But hi to Jack and Evie and Aurora and Harrison and Grace and Rosie and Jaden and Isaac and Summer and Sophie and Ira and everybody else I can see who is watching live. Everybody who's over on YouTube and also everybody who is watching on catch up. And feel free to comment as if you were live if you are watching on catch up. So as I've said, today we are going to be looking at Greek gods and goddesses. A little bit of a caveat with that though. We're not going to look at every single Greek god and goddess because we would literally be here probably all day, and I don't think that you would find it particularly interesting sitting listening to me for an entire day. But I am going to set you some optional things to go and look at and research after this lesson. But we're actually not just going to concentrate on gods and goddesses. We're also going to be kind of looking at ancient Greek beliefs. Because we did sort of touch on the concept of belief when we looked at ancient Egypt, if you were with us for the ancient Egyptians. But what is a belief? When you have a belief, what is a belief? And how does a belief differ from, say, an opinion? Or how does a belief differ from a fact? What's the difference between a belief, say, and a fact? And can beliefs be fact? Really sort of something to get you thinking and get the wires and the brain cogs turning on a Monday at 11 a.m. What actually is a belief? Wow, Alexander, visiting grandparents in Greece. Lucky you. I hope that you went and saw some ancient Greek sites. Can't get any better than going. I'm very jealous. I wish that I could go too. But what is a belief? What is it? What is it? Lots of people thinking. There's a tiny bit of a delay sometimes with the chats. I'm sure that lots of you are going to come up with the concept. But beliefs are things that people feel are the truth. So you don't often have proof of a belief. You can have, sometimes you can, depends on what your belief is. But often beliefs are things that people feel are the truth. But often the word belief is used to talk about things that people believe to be true but cannot be proven. And so that's the point. That's the difference between a belief and a fact. So you could have a factual belief and a factual opinion, but a belief really is what you feel is true, but you can't necessarily prove it. So you could have a belief, for example, that we're not the only living thing in the universe. You could believe that there are definitely aliens out there. Well, at the moment we can't actually prove that, but that could be your belief. You feel in your head and your heart, looking at the evidence to you, that is the truth, that is the truth for you. And it's great, something you might hold dear, something you might not be able to touch. It could potentially not be something you can easily prove. Well done. So absolutely, you can't necessarily prove a belief. And this isn't actually the lesson for it, but something I've often done a lot with young people is talk about the concept of philosophical beliefs. So there's lots of philosophical beliefs. The big two are, is there a God? And, how are we here? Now, all of those things really are kind of based on belief. There's nothing can 100% prove it, even if you're going to go for the Big Bang as a theory. Well, what started that and what started that? What was the first cause? So there's lots of aspects in life that is your belief, Next question. Can you remember some beliefs that the ancient Egyptians had? So we looked at the beliefs that the ancient Egyptians had. So something that the ancient Egyptians felt were the truth, but something that they couldn't necessarily prove. So can you think of the most kind of fundamental belief that the ancient Egyptians had? It's linked to mummification. Funnily enough, I am just behind this door behind me. I am currently renovating, or me and my family are currently renovating our utility, which is behind this door here. And I found my mummified tomato that was still there from the beginning of our ancient Egypt studies in before the summer. But what were the kind of fundamental ancient beliefs? So they, well done, they believed maybe believed in lots of different gods, and had lots of different kind of beliefs in lots of different gods, and they believed fundamentally in life after death, because that's why they mummified their important people, and why normal people also were mummied. Do you still have your one, Jack, as well? Awesome. I nearly took a photo, but then I thought it would be a bit random. Why is it useful to learn about people's beliefs in history? Well, it's incredibly important because your beliefs that you have are incredibly precious. And I've heard in the chat things that you hold dear to yourself that are important. They affect your life. And so when you're looking back in the past and you're looking at social history, so history to do with the people, one of the big things is to look at what those people's beliefs are. That's one of the reasons it's useful. We've talked about use, I can't remember his lesson, either the lesson or the lesson before that, about usefulness being very much about how is it helpful. And it is helpful. It's helpful because you understand beliefs affect our day-to-day life, and so it's incredibly useful to learn about people's beliefs in all aspects of history, no matter what period of time you are studying. So what I'm going to do, absolutely helps you learn about their lives. So we're going to look at about ancient Greek religion today, and I would like you to think about what questions would you like to explore further about the things that the ancient Greeks believed. So we have some questions here. We've got who, why, where, when, what, and how. So those are often the questions that we start with when we're making questions. And also, there's some other things that you might think about. So things to do with maybe worship, gods or goddesses. What did they believe about death? Did they have any specific rituals? Were there any similarities and differences between the ancient Egyptians? Did they have a sacred text? How did it impact on their architecture? There could be loads and loads of different questions that you could have in order to understand about what ancient Greeks believe. And that's what historians do. They set themselves questions. And I want to know this, and how did this happen, and what about this, and how did that impact on this thing? And so historians are always asking questions and then looking for evidence to find out the answers to these questions. So I am going to give you 30 seconds to either, you could jot them in the chat, you could jot them, would be better if you jot them down on paper, because we're going to come back to these questions at the end of the session. You are going to come back to your questions. So if you put them in the chat, they're going to be really high up in the chat later and you might actually forget them. So I would pop them down on paper and pencil. If you struggle with writing, absolutely fine. If you could maybe ask a grown-up if they could help you, or you could maybe draw your questions if you think that that is easier for you. But I'm going to give you 30 seconds to come up with some questions and see if you can come up with 3 questions that you would like to know about ancient Greek religion. Okay, that was 30 seconds. Had a mouthful of my tea whilst you were writing those. There could be lots. So who were their gods and goddesses? Why did they believe what they believed? Where did they worship? When did they worship? What happened when somebody died? What sacred texts did they have? Did they have sacred texts? How did they perform rituals? Were there any similarities and differences between the Greeks and the Egyptians? Lots and lots. So how did they worship is a really, really great question. Now I'm hoping as we go through, so we're going to go through and we're going to talk a lot about ancient Greek religion. If we talk about and answer any of your questions, you can go cha-ching, I know the answer. You could always jot it down then on the piece of paper that you've been working at. Got some lovely, how did their beliefs evolve? How did they survive with all the wars? How did they think of the gods? How important were the gods to their day-to-day life? I'm hoping that we will answer all those as we go along, and we may not, and that brings us to something that we might come up with at the end. Now, to start us off, I'm going to show you some facts about the ancient Greeks. So the first one is the Greeks only worshipped gods and not goddesses. Some gods were patrons of cities and people believed looked over them. Rituals and sacrifices were an important part of ancient Greek beliefs. Ancient Greeks built temples to honour the gods and they believed they would live in them. And priests could be men or women. Now, one of those facts, or maybe more than one of those facts, are false. And one or maybe more of those facts are true. So, your gut reaction, you might want to write down your numbers of which you think are true and which you think are false. Because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these Greek beliefs, and you're going to think about answering your own questions, and then you're going to work out which of my facts at the end, because you're going to have learned hopefully so much, you're going to work out which of these facts were true and which of these facts were false. Now, Jaden obviously knows me very well because he's saying, I think it's a trick and they're all true. Well, actually, this time they're not all true. There are some false ones in there. But you're going to work out, so jot down on your bit of paper, because I've numbered them to make it easier, which ones do you think are true and which ones do you think are false? So 1, the Greeks only worshipped gods and not goddesses. 2, some gods were patrons of cities and believed people looked over them. 3, rituals and sacrifices were an important part of ancient Greek beliefs. 4, ancient Greeks built temples to honour the gods and they believed they would live in them. And 5, priests could be men or women. So let's get going. So lots of you are thinking that some are false and some are true. There's a lot of disagreement in the chat. So let's find out. Well, the first thing to say is religion was really important to everyone living in ancient Greek times. And when you look in the past, it's hard to understand that actually belief in God and the belief in kind of the afterlife and the belief in gods and goddesses was kind of pretty much universal. In today's society, we live very much with people that are very much believers in God. There are people very much who are atheists, who believe there's no such thing as a God. And then you have people that are agnostic, people that kind of aren't really sure, kind of are open to the idea that there may be a God, but actually not entirely convinced by that belief. And so we live our society with a lot of really universal beliefs about gods and the belief in God. But in the ancient Greek times, very much similar to the ancient Egyptians, it was an incredibly important to everybody. Everyone believed in gods and goddesses. It was a huge part of their lives. And partly because there wasn't really, when you're looking at maybe the weather and whether crops succeed or fail, there wasn't really at that point any other alternative explanation for people. And so religion was incredibly important to everyone. And the ancient Greeks, very similar to the Egyptians, believed in many different gods and goddesses. So it wasn't, if you remember the keywords from ancient Egypt, it is not monotheistic. So monotheistic is that belief in one God. And most religions in today's age are monotheistic, the belief in one God. However, the ancient Greeks were exactly like the Egyptians and also the beginning of the Roman period. They were polytheistic. And polytheistic means that you believe in lots and lots of different gods and goddesses. And just like the ancient Egyptians, each god or goddess represented a certain aspect of humanity. So they kind of represented a certain aspect of everyday life and aspects of life. Now, they did have some gods and goddesses who were patrons of cities. Now, a patron is almost sort of somebody who kind of sponsors a city, if you will. We still have patrons of charities that kind of represent those charities. So they believe that gods and goddesses could be patrons of cities. So, for example, the goddess Athena was believed to watch over the city of Athens. And so there was a gigantic statue of Athena, which is in the Parthenon, which is like a famous temple in Athens, because they believed that Athena was the patron of Athens, watched over Athens, kept Athens safe. So they believe very much in this concept of patrons of cities. So you find in ancient Greece, lots of these city-states have gods or goddesses attached to them. They believed that gods and goddesses were responsible for certain parts of life too. So Ares was the god of war. Hera was the goddess of family and marriage. So lots and lots of different aspects of your life also had gods attached to them. So if you were struggling a little bit with some family problems, you might pray to Hera. Lots of different gods were attached to lots of different parts of life. Temples, so their architecture, exactly like you look at ancient Greece, ancient Egypt rather, ancient Greece, their architecture again was very, very, very much influenced by their beliefs in gods and goddesses. They built temples to honour particular gods and goddesses, and they kind of had this sort of crossover belief that almost gods and goddesses, because they had human-like qualities, some historians believe that they almost attached quite human-like characteristics to these gods. And so they believed, a lot of ancient Greeks, that the gods would live in these temples. If you built a temple to Thor, that they would live in that temple. Or even if they didn't, they would at least visit the temple. So when you did a ritual to praise that particular god, so to praise Athena, the belief was that that god or that goddess would actually at least visit. But lots of Greeks believed that actually, if you had a temple built and honoured for that particular god, that the god would actually visit, almost like a human-like quality, and sort of live in that temple. Now, most ceremonies did not take place inside the temples. Very, very similar to the ancient Romans. They often had an altar outside the temple, and any sort of rituals were actually carried out outside the temple. And if you've ever been to any ancient Greek sites where they have temple ruins, and it's the same in early ancient Roman sites as well, you will find that the altar is situated outside. They don't tend to be performing these rituals inside. Now, we have very limited information about what actually happened during these rituals and ceremonies. There is not really lots of evidence about these rituals and ceremonies. They believe that animals were sacrificed, that this kind of sacrificial concept of sacrificing an animal on the altar was an important part of the ancient Greek worship. So they would sacrifice an animal on these altars outside these temples as a way of showing respect and love and to please the Greek gods and goddesses. But really, there is very limited historical evidence about it because there wasn't much written at the time. And also, if you're thinking of archaeological evidence, there is very limited archaeological evidence other than particular bones that may have been excavated by archaeologists. They believe that prayers would have been said and that they would have maybe given other offerings like drinks or food to the gods and goddesses. But not really a lot more is known about that. One of the most interesting things, though, if you're looking at ancient Greek belief, we have looked a lot in previous lessons about how men and women were not equal, other than more so in Sparta. But in most city-states, there was very, very, very poor equality. Women were expected to stay in the home, look after the home, they had very limited educational opportunities, and they didn't leave the home without permission of their husband. And we talked also about even the Olympic Games, that was very unequal in terms of women weren't allowed to partake or even watch. However, when you are looking at ancient Greek religion, there is very much equality. So being a priest was one of the few roles that women were allowed to hold as a position of responsibility. And that's because they had gods and they had goddesses. So they had male gods and they had female gods. And so if you had a temple that was built for one of the female goddesses, say maybe Aphrodite, then the belief was that the priest of that particular temple should be female. So if you had a temple built for a male god, you would have a male priest. And if you had a temple built for a female goddess, you would have a female priest. And it was the priest that carried out those ceremonies and that led those rituals. And so when you're looking at the disparity between the experience of men in ancient Greece and the experience of women, when you're looking at religion, it's very much a position of equality. So that's kind of giving you an overview, very much an overview of ancient Greek beliefs. I've had a question about, did they have a sacred text? No, not really. They didn't have a particular sacred text. They had lots and lots of Greek myths and stories, which we will be looking at later, but they didn't have sort of a specific sacred text like lots of religions do. Now, you should have worked out, therefore, that the Greeks only worshipping gods and not goddesses was, in fact, false. But, drum roll, please, that is that everything else was true. So the only thing that was false was the first one. So I'm hoping that has helped you learn something about an overview of their kind of beliefs and why they were so important. Now, that leads us on to kind of why they were so important, because they believed when good things happened, it was because the gods and the goddesses were happy about how humans were living on Earth. So if your crops were, your crops were growing and people were happy and you weren't in a state of war with any other city-states, then it was obviously that the gods and the goddesses were happy with you. And, you would sacrifice to the gods and you would give them offerings of wine and food and these sacrificial animals to kind of try and keep them happy, because they believed that all aspects of your life were controlled by the gods and the goddesses, which means that when there were disasters, if your crops failed, if you were having lots of bad weather, if there was a problem in your town or your city with how things were being run, or something awful happened, then the way that they would explain that, they wouldn't say, oh, well, our crops have failed because we've had a really cold winter. They would say it's because the gods are sad. We've done something wrong. We've made mistakes. We've been naughty. And the gods and goddesses are angry with us. And this is how they are choosing to punish us. So it didn't matter what aspect of your life, when things were going well, it was because the gods and goddesses were pleased with you. And when things were going badly, it was because the gods and goddesses were punishing you and trying to teach you something that you've done wrong, and they were angry. And so that's how a lot of things in society was explained. Some of you are saying that you were wrong about the true and false. Don't worry, that is absolutely fine. That's learning. I'd be worried if you'd got them all right. I wouldn't be teaching you anything. And so another thing to say is that because we've talked about the fact that ancient Greece wasn't a unified empire, like, say, the Romans and the Egyptians, the Greeks were these little city-states. There were some variations in how the Greeks worshipped the gods. And so we don't have time to kind of go into that in huge detail, but it is something, if you're really interested, to go and look at how those beliefs altered dependent on what city states you were in. So if you lived in Sparta, your kind of belief and how you worship the gods might be slightly different to what you believed and who you worshipped and how you worshipped if you were in Athens. That said, festivals were really an important way that the ancient Greeks worshipped. They might have musical festivals, they might have sporting competitions. A really good example is obviously what we've already looked at, which was the Olympic Games. So that was obviously a kind of an opportunity to worship the gods, and that was included in the festival of Zeus. So there were lots and lots of festivals, a bit like we kind of have festivals today. So dependent on what religion we believe in, and sometimes we have cultural festivals that link with our society, but they also did have festivals a bit like we do today. So, what do you think is the most significant piece of evidence you've heard? What do you think is kind of tells you what was the most significant part of religion to the Greeks? What do you think is the most significant piece of evidence that you've heard so far? So, I'm going to give you 20 seconds just to have a little think. What do you think the most significant piece of evidence you've heard so far? Or if you find significant means important, if you find that hard, maybe you could just think about what you found the most interesting. But what do you think is the most significant? If you were learning about ancient Greece and you were going to write a book about ancient Greece, what would you think would be the most significant thing you would write about concerning their beliefs in gods and goddesses? What do you think? So I'm going to share mine while I'm waiting for you to have a think. For me, it's the fact that all aspects of life they believed were the gods or goddesses either pleased with them or unpleased with them. For me, I think that is very, very different to how I live my life. If I make mistakes or things go wrong, I certainly don't believe it's because God is cross with me. And I sometimes think that must have a massive impact on your life, because it almost takes responsibility. Almost gives you more responsibility for something that's gone wrong because you believe that actually someone's telling you off. And also it kind of gives you less responsibility. So you kind of feel like there was, you weren't in control, that actually it was the gods and goddesses. I think that's a very, very different way to live your life, and something that's very significant when you're looking at the ancient Greeks. Some people are saying about the temples because it would have potentially changed the architecture and the look of the architecture. The fact that women were allowed to play a large part. So that's, again, really important, because I think you can study the Greeks, very much get a view of inequality, and there definitely was, but that is really one caveat to it. Awesome. Well done. Now, the ancient Greeks believed that the 12 most powerful gods and goddesses lived at the top of a huge mountain called Mount Olympus. However, some very important gods and goddesses, such as Hades, who was the god of the underworld, did not live there. So there are the sort of main gods kind of lived, they believed, on Mount Olympus. Again, that kind of almost human quality of their gods. And they believed that the gods and goddesses held meetings up there. It's where their disputes were settled. And the ancient Greeks believed that goddesses and gods were immortal. What does immortal mean? So I am very much mortal, but what does immortal mean? Well, immortal means that you can never die. So I'm definitely mortal. I wouldn't survive standing in front of a big bus. So I'm definitely mortal. We're all mortal. But gods and goddesses are immortal. So immortal means that you live forever. However, even though they were immortal and extremely powerful, they did again believe that they had faults, just like humans do. So if you look at lots of the stories of the gods and goddesses, a lot of the myths and legends, some of the gods and goddesses definitely have faults. They're not perfect. And again, that's quite a different kind of view of gods and goddesses, because quite often when we look at gods and goddesses, lots of people and views are that they must have believed they were perfect, but they definitely weren't. So the 12 most important gods and goddesses lived on Mount Olympus, and we're going to look at some of the gods, because some of you are already saying, well, what gods did they have? Who were those gods? Lots of people love Greek mythology and the gods. A podcast called Greeking Out. Wow, I need to go and check that one out. That sounds really cool. What you can do, if you would like, is we're going to talk about some of the sort of main gods. I'm not going to show you the illustrations that the Twinkle Illustrator have done of them, but if you want, while we're talking, based on what I'm saying, you could do a really quick sketch of what you think the god looks like. So as we're talking, you could maybe draw, if you like drawing along, you could do a really quick 20-second sketch of what you think each god would have looked like in your head if you were worshipping them as an ancient Greek, based on what I'm going to say. And the first god that we're going to look at is we're going to look at Zeus. Just picking up on a point, invincible is a really great way of describing immortal. I love it. So Zeus is the first god that we are going to look at. Now, Zeus was believed to be the most powerful of all of the gods. So he was the god of the sky, and he was the king of Mount Olympus. So where those 12 gods and goddesses lived, where all their disputes and talking occurred, he was the king of Mount Olympus. And he was the most powerful of all of the gods. He was married to the queen of the gods, Hera, and the Greek belief was that his temper affected the weather. So when he was angry, he threw thunderbolts. So if you were in really stormy, torrential weather, then you would say Zeus is angry, and it's Zeus that is affecting the weather. There are important symbols associated with Zeus, so the thunderbolt and the eagle. I'm interested to know whether you have how you have drawn him, but this is definitely a really great picture of him that shows that he is really kind of strong. And look at him throwing that thunderbolt. So there is some facts about Zeus, and I'd like you to work out which one is not true. So the first one is that the ancient Greeks thought he was 1 billion years old, that Zeus was the god of the sky, that Zeus is often shown carrying the symbols of a thunderbolt and an eagle, or Zeus's father was worried that his children would betray him, so he ate them. Zeus's mother tricked his father by giving him a rock to eat so that Zeus was free. Which one do we think isn't true? That is a great myth, the idea that Zeus's father was going to eat his children because he was worried they would betray him, but Zeus escaped because his mother gave Zeus's father a rock. Now, the one that is not true is this one. So well done if you got it correct. The ancient Greeks thought that he was 1 billion years old. That is, in fact, made up. Now we're going to look at another Greek god or goddess. We're going to look at this time at Artemis. And again, you could draw a picture of her as we're talking. But Artemis was the daughter of Zeus, and she was the twin sister of Apollo. She was a moon goddess. So the Greeks believed that she was responsible for the movement of the moon across the sky. They believed that she had a chariot, and that chariot was pulled by a stag, and that when you saw the moon move, it was actually Artemis moving it. So we've looked at the phases of the moon and how the moon moves with the seasons. That's how they kind of argued that the moon was kind of pulled by Artemis in her chariot, pulled by a stag. They believed she was a really amazing huntress, and she was a protector of animals and young women. And this is the picture that our illustrators have drawn of her. I'd love to know if you are drawing along, if you could let me, if you can share those pictures. But what won this time is, in fact, fiction. So there's only one again. The first one is that deers and stags were associated with Artemis. Artemis is often shown wearing a crescent moon on her head. So sometimes you see drawings or statues and she has a moon behind her head. Artemis also carried a sword, and Artemis was born one day before her twin Apollo and was seen to be his protector. So which one do you think is not true? You can see lots of people actually sharing some other Greek myths in the chat. That's really some great points. I'll come back and read them. Hopefully you've got the sword one. Well done, Jack. Is the false one. Artemis also carries a sword. Is not true. Usually she is shown with her bow and arrow. So the next one we're looking at is Aries. So again, feel free to have a little sketch of what you think Aries would look like. So Aries was the son of Zeus and Hera, but they did not like him. He was the god of war. He represented the anger that many humans show when fighting in a battle. He was known to complain when things didn't go his way. So any stories that have Aries in them, often he is known to be cross and complain when things don't go his way. And there's a really famous Greek myth around Aries where he killed a giant, fierce monster. This huge, giant, fierce monster who was an enemy of the gods, and gods were worried about him, and he killed this giant, fierce monster. Now, he was the god of war. This is how he's shown. It's probably one of my favourite illustrations of Aries. I really like this drawing. So what do you think on this one is fact or fiction? He's not popular with the other gods and goddesses or with the ancient Greeks. So not many people actually worshipped him. In some Greek stories, the only person who likes Aries is Aphrodite. Aries carries the symbols of the sword, spear and helmet. I can see that I've messed up my PowerPoint list. Already given you the answer. I've already put the cross on. He's never drawn without his helmet. I've already given you the answer to that one. That is actually the false one. He was never drawn without his helmet. I've got my animations not set right on that one. But yes, he wasn't really well worshipped, Aries. Lots of Greeks didn't like him. The gods didn't like him. And so supposedly, because you see lots of different disparities with the myths, things, we're going to look at the myths in a second very briefly, but there's definitely a suggestion that the only god that liked Aries was actually Aphrodite. Right, the next one is Apollo. So Apollo was the son of Zeus and the twin brother of Artemis. He was the sun god. Now, the ancient Greeks did not know that it is Earth that moves around the sun. So they believed it was Apollo who was responsible for the movement of the sun across the sky. And they thought that he moved the sun with a chariot pulled by a golden horse. So again, when you're looking out and you see throughout the course of the day the sun moving, the Greek belief was that it was Apollo moving it with his chariot. He was the god of archery, prophecy and music, and this is how he is shown, which is quite different actually to how I imagine him, this one. I imagine him to look far more powerful than that. I don't know why, but yeah, lots of people. Now, the next one. Apollo had healing powers. He was the god of so many things. Even the ancient Greeks got confused. Animals linked to Apollo include the dolphin, wolf and raven. And Apollo's son was Asclepion. So which one here do you think is not true? Which one do you think is not true? Well, the answer is this one. Apollo's son was actually known as Asclepius, and Asclepius was the god of healing, and lots of temples were created for Asclepius, where the sick would often go in order to be healed, and the temples were known as Asclepians, but actually Asclepius was the god, his son. So that is the one that is incorrect. Right, Aphrodite. You've probably heard of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and the protector of sailors. She was loved and worshipped by a lot of Greek people. She was born when Uranus was killed. The story is that his blood fell into the sea and Aphrodite emerged from the froth. So that's another kind of story and legend. And in Sparta, she was very much worshipped as the goddess of war. This is how our illustrator has chosen to draw her. It's a nice thing to do, to go and draw them. Now, which one is fact or fiction? Aphrodite had 17 children. There's more artwork and statues of Aphrodite than any other Greek god. Aphrodite's clothes were reported to have healing properties. Aphrodite changed a statue into a human so that one of her loyal followers could have the statue as his wife. So what do we think the answer is? Well, it's this one. She did supposedly, in the myths, have 17 children, and there is more artwork and statues of Aphrodite than any other Greek god. So, we'll just move this on a minute because we've looked at lots of these and we're running a bit late. Well, not late, but it's taken quite a bit of time. So the ancient Greeks didn't have a sacred text, and they learnt all about the Greeks' gods and goddesses from listening to their parents, from watching worship, from looking at statues and paintings on walls and pottery, and listening to others telling the myths. The myths were not written down, and there's lots of people saying in the chat, well, I know that this is not true, that this is different, and this is different, and this is different, and that's not right, because I can see some of that already in the chat. The actual fact is that ancient Greek myths were not written down. They were not written down. They were not contemporary sources. They weren't ever recorded at the time. They were just retold orally. And so therefore, there's a lot of disagreement, particularly between historians, of what the actual myths would have been at the time. Because if you've just told, if you go and tell a story, someone else tells a story, someone else then goes and tells that story, and then someone else goes and tells that story, then that story is going to change. And we also know that actually the beliefs altered between city-states as well. So what you believed in Athens might be different to what you believed in Sparta, for example. And so actually it's really, really hard to understand exactly what these stories that were told and exactly what their finite beliefs were, because we don't have written records of it. It was not like, say, the Christians have their stories written in a Bible. There were no stories. These were not recorded. It is an oral history. And therefore, when lots of you are saying about, well, that isn't true because that person's supposed to be the sister, not the father or the son or the brother or what have you, you will find when you get into Greek mythology, you will find there is disparity and argument and disagreement because we don't have the finite resource, the finite source of the perfect story. And the story I might have told of Zeus might have been different to what my next door neighbour was saying. And so that is something that's really, really important when you're retelling stories orally and you don't actually have a written text from the time. It makes disagreement, when we're talking thousands of years later, quite common. So that is something to bear in mind. The other thing, though, is that we're going to move on from that because I've done lots and lots and lots of talking and I've planned too much. But lots and lots of stories, lots of Greek myths are still told today. They're retold in films, they're put into books, and they were a bit like lots of other stories, but they are told just for more than entertainment. It was about how the Greeks understood about the world, how they understood about what they should believe, what they understood about how we came to be on earth, or how the gods and goddesses came to rule, or what's going to happen in life after death. And they also had morals. A lot of the myths gave the ancient Greeks messages or lessons about how they should live their lives. And so there's lots of variations. Lots of people are saying goodbye. I haven't finished. I'm just skipping on a bit because I've planned too much. I haven't finished quite yet. So don't leave me yet, or I'll be talking to myself. But there's definitely variations. And so that's something I really wanted to press on you, that when you go and start looking at this, you will definitely find there's variations in the story. And so what I'm going to leave you with is this. Look at the questions that you wrote down at the start of the lesson. How many questions have you been able to answer? Now, if there are some questions that you haven't been able to answer, then what you can do between now and next week is you can go and try and find the answers. The other thing that you could do is start to look at some of the other gods and goddesses that we haven't looked at. So if you go to the Twinkle website, you'll find there's lots of information about lots of gods and goddesses, because at the start of next lesson, I'm going to be introducing you to some more gods and goddesses and finding out whether you know something about each of them. But we can't cover all of them. Next week is our last session, and we are going to be looking at some myths, and we're going to be looking at how that myth differs depending on where it's told, and we're also going to be looking at whether there's any historical facts behind some of the Greek myths. And the Greek myth that we're going to look at next week is the Trojan horse, the myth around the Trojan horse. So have a lovely week. I will see you next week. Good luck looking at all of some more gods and goddesses and those myths, and I will see you next week.